It's my nerd world. Welcome to it. My name is John Justice, and I just have a really simple question that I want to ask today. Is it time for a new Star Wars? And I don't mean a new Star Wars. I mean, is there now room for a new fantasy-driven science fiction space opera series that has been dominated since 1972 by Star Wars and what George Lucas created? Now, this is not a dig at all on Star Wars. I've really enjoyed and continue to enjoy and look forward to the content coming out on Disney Plus and hopefully in the theaters in the next few years. I've enjoyed the Disney Star Wars era content, as I have everything before it. I'm an individual that loves The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker. My biggest disappointments as of late when it comes to Star Wars has really just been around the production quality of Kenobi and Book of Boba Fett. Neither of those shows really landed that well for me. And Book of Boba Fett was more just the storytelling aspect of it, although I had some issues with the quality of the production work as well. But we're talking about live action, so you can't harp on it too much, except when you watch some other pieces of content, and I'll get to that in just a moment. Netflix recently dropped a trailer showing their upcoming releases. One of those releases is the Zack Snyder movie, which is actually going to be 2 parts, I guess, Rebel Moon. Now, I'm really excited for Rebel Moon. I happen to be a fan of Zack Snyder. Seeing some of the very brief footage in this Netflix trailer and going down a bit of a rabbit hole from some of the production work and other images that have been released, it's pretty clear that Zack Snyder's Rebel Moon is going to end up falling into, aesthetically, and probably in terms of action and tone, that more adult action that Zack Snyder produces. If you look at the science fiction elements of Man of Steel, which I really enjoyed, you look at the action elements and some of the science fiction elements of Sucker Punch, which is another movie that I enjoyed. And again, based off of the brief footage we saw in that Netflix teaser and some of the images, the aesthetics of Zack Snyder's Rebel Moon are very much going to be Zack Snyder-esque. Very, very adult, very kinetic, slow motion, drab. Looking forward to it. I can't wait. But it doesn't do, in my opinion, what Star Wars did. Star Wars and what George Lucas created was this very unique combination. As George always said, it was more fantasy than it was science fiction, and he really blended those two things well together. Now, in that time, and especially during the Disney era, as we move away from the theatrical releases, we've gotten further and further from the fantasy element of Star Wars. Kenobi aside, and Clone Wars, sure, Bad Batch a little bit, but really we've been focusing more on, I don't want to say the science fiction aspect of it exclusively, but certainly when it comes to Star Wars, we've moved away from Jedis and lightsabers for the most part, focusing more on Mandalorian lore and dark sabers, less of the fantasy, more Lord of the Rings elements. So I've been consuming other space opera science fiction content as of late. I've talked about how great Foundation is, in my opinion. Second season comes out here in just a couple of months. And I recently started rewatching The Expanse, enjoying both of these series. Now, of course, Foundation, going back to Isaac Asimov, that's a very old piece of work. The series loosely resembles what Isaac Asimov put in his stories, and it has the potential, depending on what they do, I think, to be a little bit more Star Wars-y. Expanse is more of your harder science fiction. They try to keep it a little bit more zeroed in on reality. You take something like Avatar. Now, I'm excited for Avatar. I loved the first Avatar, really loved The Way of Water. As a matter of fact, watching The Way of Water, I remember sitting in the theater thinking, oh my gosh, am I going to end up gravitating towards Avatar the way that I did Star Wars? But all of this gets back to my initial question of, is it time for a new Star Wars? Is there now a lane open for an entity, a company, a creative outlet, an author? And I'm open to suggestions if you've read anything that sort of fills this, where they can take aspects of what George Lucas did and create an entire new story that can excite fans of Star Wars and new fans the way that I was excited when I was 5 years old seeing Star Wars for the first time. Star Wars has become very diluted. There's a lot of content that's out there. I think that there's power in scarcity. There certainly was in the original trilogy. When you think of musical acts, I'm a massive Depeche Mode fan. I do a Depeche Mode podcast. I've been, again, I was a fan of Depeche Mode music before I was a fan of any other music, going back to 1986, and they have a new album coming out, and I'm clamoring to hear new material because they just don't release material that often anymore. And in the early years of Star Wars, that's the way it was. Now, we've got more Star Wars than we know how to cover. I do a weekly Star Wars podcast, and I have trouble sort of zeroing in on exactly what I want to talk about because I want to cover all of it. But even now, while we're waiting for other things to come out, we have trailers for The Mandalorian. We have rumors of a Damon Lindelof movie. We have The Bad Batch that's currently rolling out. Ahsoka's coming up. We have the Skeleton Crew movie. There's a lot of Star Wars coming out, which is great for Star Wars fans. But again, it's moved away, in my view, from what George originally created. And what George originally created was a riff off of things that he saw in his childhood. So it's not like George Lucas created the space opera. This goes back to Burroughs. This goes back to Queen of Mars, John Carter of Mars, Flash Gordon. George Lucas originally wanted to do Flash Gordon stories, couldn't get the rights for it, and he ended up creating Star Wars. I've always said that, and when I wrote my EMBARK science fiction space opera series, basing it on Earth, sending Earth and humanity out into space so I can tell my own epic space opera, I did that because I didn't want to directly have it compared to George Lucas by creating an entirely different world in a galaxy far, far away, because I've always contended that anybody that does that is just going to be compared to George Lucas. That might be the case, but I feel like there's now an avenue. I feel like somebody can do that because we have had so much Star Wars. I feel like somebody can take those initial things that George Lucas was inspired by and go and create something new. And again, I thought that perhaps, and maybe we will, but I thought that perhaps Rebel Moon, of what Zack Snyder was creating, would do that. But that is certainly, from what I'm seeing, geared much more towards adults. And I'm thinking something more of a cross between science fiction and Lord of the Rings, bringing in those fantasy elements, doing something different and unique, but creating a space opera fantasy. Whereas before, people were afraid to go and do that. I know that I would love to see something like that. I feel like we get these sort of segmented types of science fiction now that all kind of deviate away from what George did, whether it's The Expanse or whether it's, Foundation, which are both, again, Earth-based, one in the much, much farther future as it relates to Foundation. But I would love to see somebody go and create a completely new fantasy world set aside from Earth, riffing off of Flash Gordon and those serials back from when George Lucas was a kid, or what was written with the William S. Burroughs books as well. I think there's space for it now, and I hope somebody goes and tries to take advantage of it, because I think there's an audience for it. Come out with a singular product. See if people grab a hold of it, and you can build something off of it. Avatar to me is really exciting because we have a franchise now, and whether or not James Cameron will allow offshoots of Avatar remains to be seen. But I'm excited for a new franchise, for a new IP that we're going to be getting five stories. And again, this is nothing against the Star Wars that exists. I just feel like there's a lane there now that could be taken advantage of. What do you think? I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment on YouTube. You can email me, talkshownerd@gmail.com. Do you think it's time for a new Star Wars? Do you think there's space within the pop culture fandom for a science fiction, space opera series, fantasy, not based on Earth, that may somewhat resemble Star Wars, but is completely different? Is there an audience there for it? Would you be interested in something like that? Have you read any independent novels that fit that bill that I should be made aware of? Again, leave a comment up on YouTube or drop me an email, talkshownerd@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. If you are watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Smash the button that gives you notifications when new videos pop up. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts as well. Again, talkshownerd@gmail.com. Bye.